It's always fun to share the microphone with Deanna, my wife. We're both pilots and we're both instructors, and we both work in the PA-46 world. And we're both a little bit on the sad side, because if you look at the last 9 to 10 months of accidents that have happened in the PA-46 world, there's been a lot of fatal accidents, much, much more than we've had in the past. And we think it's important for us to be able to look at each one of the accidents in a broad brush stroke and be able to talk about some of the threads that we find that are the threads that flows between each one of these. And so we asked Deanna to come sit at the table with us today, and sort of let's just kind of break down some of these flights. Let's break down not all the way, it's not like a breakdown, but let's talk about these flights and note some common threads and maybe come up with some ideas that some people can listen to and think about what's going on in their lives, and look at what's happened in some other people that have lost their lives. Because you know what, in the end of the day, aviation is not safe. It's only safe insofar as the person that's in the left front seat makes that flight safe. So we have a fairly unsafe environment that we make safe by making good action. So we need good piloting out there, don't we?
We do, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of these accidents, and maybe talk about the whys, and maybe just give us some of your thoughts as we break this down.
Okay.
All right. So here we go. The first accident happened on Monday, 23 October 2023. It's 92884. Is a JetPROP, and basically the JetPROP took off from near Pierre, South Dakota, took off, made a left climbing turn, appeared to get up to well above a maneuvering altitude, meaning it was 9 or 10,000 feet, and what appears to be a engine failure or a power rollback ended up making a turn back to the runway, and then effectively didn't make the runway.
Right. So let's branch off here a second outside of this accident specifically, because we've got a few we're going to talk about that are related to an engine failure or a power rollback, for which the NTSB will clarify, what happened there. But let's talk a little bit about how do you know the difference? And even if you do know or don't know the difference, is your reaction any different between the scenarios? Do you do anything any differently if you have a power loss versus a power rollback on that step one item?
If you look back, the answer is no. The answer's if you think you have a power rollback or an engine failure, you can't diagnose the very quickly. There are some telltale signs, and if you're really, really good, you can look at the NG and see if it's down low. You can look at your torque. You look at all your parameters. Oil pressure. By the time you analyze all that, really some action needs to occur. So the answer is if you think you have a power rollback, or if you think you have an engine failure.
Right. So if you've had any uncommanded power loss.
In a turbine,
mm-hmm.
Your answer is you need to go to the more switch or more lever, because if you have an engine failure and you go to the more lever or more switch, and because it's a more switch in a JetPROP or more lever in all the other airplanes, if you bring that more, I'm just going to call it the more, you bring the more forward, you activate the more. If it's an engine failure, you did nothing you didn't hurt a thing.
Not hurting a thing.
Not hurting a thing. But if it is a power rollback, then you just saved the day.
Absolutely.
And if you look at this accident, which I look at, basically this airplane took off, climbed up, had an event, turned back to the airport. I note in one place where the airplane turned away from the runway, not arguably, you should definitely have flown over the airport, spiraled down, and made a landing at the airport. It looks like he could have made it to the airport. He didn't. He landed off field, and whenever he landed off field, which looked like a spectacular landing in a rough ground, the pilot survived, but the passenger died in the accident. And if you look at the airplane, one of the things I note in that airplane is that the prop is not feathered.
Right.
So this is probably not an engine failure, because an engine failure, your NG winds down all the way, your oil pressure stops, and the big spring in the hub of the propeller is going to shove that,
automatically feather it.
going to bring it hard.
Yeah. Now, I've tested this with a JetPROP pilot a couple times on shutting down without feathering the propeller first, and it takes about 90 seconds for it to fully feather from that position. But you're right, in these pictures, they were probably aloft for more than that 90 seconds, and those propellers weren't anywhere near a feathered position.
Let's talk about that because you're right. One of the best ways, if you're a JetPROP pilot or a Meridian pilot for that matter, except the JetPROP pilot has the ability to feather automatically or not. So if you take a JetPROP and you just take while you're sitting on the ground, just sitting out in front of the ramp, and you shut down the engine with the prop lever forward, okay, you shut down the engine and watch the prop. The prop will feather.
It will.
But it will take a while. In other words, when you feather the prop, you're actually dumping the oil pressure that's up in that hub, and instantly the prop goes, it goes to a feathered position. If you look at a Meridian, M600, M500, M700, you notice that when the condition lever is not just a condition lever, it says cut off and feather. So what you're actually doing is two things. You're cutting off the engine by shutting off the fuel flow at the fuel control. You're also dumping the fuel in the hub, feathering the prop instantly. So the JetPROP, I'm really glad we have the JetPROP in our community for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that it just exemplifies, you can do things with the JetPROP because you have control of the prop.
Right.
So if an engine fails, you're going to be a while until the prop is going to go all the way to feather. If it's a failure and you didn't dump the pressure,
didn't feather it yourself.
That's exactly right. So one of the takeaways from this accident, certainly for anybody that's listening as a turbine pilot, is if you think you have an engine failure, you're eventually you got to get that prop to the cutoff and feather position, or in a JetPROP, feather the prop. I personally think this particular accident is a power rollback, because if you look at he glided for way longer than a minute, way longer than 3 minutes. But you look at the prop, and the prop hit the ground, that prop is not in the feathered position. Right. That prop's in the flat pitch position, which means he probably had a power rollback.
Yeah. And then the question is, was the Moore switch attempted, or was it just in the heat of the moment?
Yeah.
Which goes back to just practice. I mean, in the heat of the moment, your adrenaline is so high. Things are happening so fast. Everything's unexpected. It is so easy to make mistakes and errors and not do what you were trained to do. And that's why, at every training event we have with a turbine pilot, we're breaking out that Moore switch or Moore lever and making sure that,
they know where it's at.
That they know where it's at and
they know
how it works, and about that delay prior to it kicking in, because that delay will get those who have not used that switch before.
That's exactly right. There's a dead band. Maybe that's the right. I don't know if that's the right word, but that's the way I call it, a dead band, where you move the Moore lever forward, and there's a dead area. Nothing happens, and then all of a sudden a lot happens. The engine responds real quickly. You need to understand how to use that more. You need to. When we train in every training event that we have with the turbine. We're taking the airplane, simulating that engine power rollback, and letting them bring the Moore lever forward, and then we go fly an approach all the way into the ground. And we think that's critical for people to understand. You need to really understand the feathering of the prop. You really need to understand the difference between a power rollback and an engine failure, and be comfortable enough to reach down there and actually know where the switch is. I've had pilots that have come to me that didn't even know what that was.
Right.
So if you don't even know if you're a turbine pilot, a single engine turbine pilot, don't know what a Moore is, don't have comfort with that lever or that switch, you need to get with an instructor and get that comfort level.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big gigantic takeaways. One of the questions maybe is, why do we teach it this way? If you look at a turbine, the chances of a power rollback are way greater. I don't know the numbers. I've told people 10 times as great. I don't have it. That's anecdotal. Your chances of having a power rollback are far greater than having an engine failure in a turbine.
Right. Yeah. The PT6s are just so reliable. I mean, you'd have to it's usually going to be an ancillary system like a fuel line came loose, or
You ran it out of fuel.
you ran it out of fuel. Exactly. Some sort of fuel exhaustion. Like, rarely do things just come apart and break in a PT6. So it usually is a power rollback, or one of the accessories to the PT6.
You know, I'll be a little bit, I don't know, scared to say it, but we went so long in the PA-46 community without an engine failure, like the turbine engine fail, that I almost got to the place where it's like, is it really worth teaching an engine out in a turbine engine, PA-46? And I almost got, is it really worth training it? Because training an engine out, there is risk involved in training an engine out. It's one of the things as an instructor that we probably accept or inherit a higher level of risk, because we're doing engine out training. We're going all the way to the ground because we need to. And when you think about that, there's a level of risk. But since then, this of course was back in the teens when I thought this. I never acted upon it. I never stopped training that. And then all of a sudden we had a rash of turbine failures where we had a couple JetPROP engine failure where the engine failed. One person ran it out of gas. We had another person that had a failure of the engine, undetermined why it failed, but we know it failed because we had a trend monitor that told us. So when you think about that and you look at it, the answer is it is definitely worth doing the training in a turbine.
Absolutely.
Because you can have a power rollback or an engine failure. But the chances of that power rollback are so high. That's why, in my opinion, and I believe your opinion, if you even think it's a failure or a rollback, grab that more, bring it forward, because there's a lot greater chance that you just saved the day than you just added fuel to a dead engine.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. The second airplane that we need to talk about was 510 Kilo Charlie. And this is a really, really sad event. This is a good friend of ours. This is somebody that we know. The bottom line on this accident is we don't really know what happened. We know that something happened at low altitude. That it took off, and within a very low altitude, 200-300 feet at most, the airplane had some kind of an engine problem and crashed in a neighborhood. The pilot died. The passenger survived, thankfully. And this was a guy that I knew, great guy. We don't know if it's a power rollback. We don't know if it was an engine failure. But this was one that I'd like to think was a power rollback, but we just simply don't know.
Right. Yeah. We simply don't know.
We simply don't know.
It fits the scenario, of immediately after takeoff and, a loss at that time or a change in something at that time. The pilot had 10 years in that airplane or something close
Longer
to it.
than that, I believe. Yeah, he was actually the original, or not the original, he originally owned it as a piston airplane and had the airplane converted to a JetPROP. So he owned the airplane for a long, long, long
Right.
time.
So the chances of this being something like someone who is new to the airframe that might tend to overpitch on rotation or something like that, the chances of that are slimmer in this scenario because he had owned the aircraft and flown it for so long that the thought that this is probably a power rollback or engine failure just comes straight to the forefront of your mind.
It does. A great guy, a fine pilot. This was one that really hit us in the gut, without a doubt. But from a training perspective of the people listening to this, one of the things that you need to think about is if you've got a turbine engine, that doesn't mean that you can't have an engine failure or power rollback. It means you have a better engine. I'll fly behind a PT6 any day before a piston. I'm happy with both, but a turbine is better. There's no doubt about it. Your chances of a failure are better, or your chances of a failure of an engine failure are better in a piston airplane. I personally like the turbines better for sure. If you had to, but that doesn't mean it can't fail.
Right.
You still need to know what you need. And let me say one more thing. What these two accidents really say is that you need, in every multi-engine airplane that you take off in, if you're an airline pilot or you have a Cessna 421, or any of these airplanes, you're literally making a pre-takeoff statement.
I was just about to say the same thing.
Talk about that.
Yeah, so even if you are single pilot and single engine, I kind of laugh because I just got out of simulator training for a single pilot aircraft, and they made me do pre-departure briefings, and and I told the guy, I'm like, I normally do these in my head because it's just me. There's nobody else. There's not another crew member there to brief. But just the act of getting that out of your head
Yes.
and verbalizing it, say it out loud. Say out loud what you're going to do in the event of an engine failure prior to a certain airspeed, prior to reaching a certain point on the runway. And if one happens immediately after takeoff, if you verbalize that in advance, you are much more likely for the muscle memory of your body to follow through with that rather than get caught off guard when it actually happens.
I'm gonna make a point on this one because I've got a Porterfield that has a terrible engine, and I literally took off.
Awful.
It's a terrible, yeah, it's terrible. It's a terrible engine. It's like the first engine Lycoming ever made was the Lycoming engine, the 0145 that's sitting on my Porterfield out here. And I taxied out to runway 25 the other day, and I literally had the mindset, because it was about a month or two since I've flown it. And I was on the runway thinking, okay, the wind is from my left front, and if anything fails, I'm going to land either straight ahead, but if I get up to 100 feet, I'm going to land on 16. Because
the intersecting runway at the airport.
Because I've got another option past that. I mean, I'll make a left turn and land there. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. I took off, got to about 150 feet or so. The engine gave me a little sputter you don't have, when you're taking off, it doesn't take, a hiccup, and it'll get my attention.
Right.
And that thing hiccuped. It just hiccuped, and I pulled the throttle back, came over there and landed on 16. But here's the point behind it. I was literally thinking to myself the whole time, because I have a really junky, antique engine, what do I need to do if I have an engine failure on this? Do I have an option? Literally, if you're taking off in any PA-46, you ought to be thinking to yourself, okay, if the engine fails while I'm still on the runway, I'm closing the throttle, landing straight ahead. If I get off the ground, I'm going to land straight ahead. If I have this much of runway, if I can't see the runway in front of me, I'm landing on the runway. Mm-hmm. If I can't see some runway, if I can't, I'm landing in whatever I'm picking the best option I've got in the windshield, and my field elevation is 300 feet, and so 1,300 feet is going to be the earliest I'm going to make a turn back.
Yeah, and another rule of thumb that I use is I touch nothing below 400 feet AGL. Nothing. I don't adjust my power. I don't raise my flaps. I'll raise my gear.
Yeah, I bet to say I'm pulling the gear.
Positive rate gear's coming up. But after that, I don't touch the power. I don't touch the flaps. I don't do anything until I hit 400 feet AGL. And because studies show that if you're going to experience an engine problem, it's going to be when you go to touch that power lever right after takeoff, whether that be that's anecdotal in the piston
Meaning
world.
just where your hand touches it, or you're touching something.
You've changed something. Mm-hmm.
That's not a bad idea. That's not. I normally don't think of the 400 feet. I think of 400 feet making a turn. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to institute that into my thought process. That's for sure.
It's a good one, and it's a nice altitude. It's not actually a nice altitude when you've experienced engine loss. 400 feet goes really fast. But it's a good altitude where you have some visibility. You're not staring at the trees off the end. It's a good altitude to make a decision on being able to make a turn, probably not a 180 back to the runway by that point. That's not enough altitude for that. But, that 45 degrees either side of your nose, pick your point, land more or less straight ahead.
Yes, and more pick your best spot in the windshield. Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got two other accidents that happened in 2023. So October was just a terrible month with the two turbine accidents, two JetPROPs. Then in late 2023, and one in early 2024, December 31st was an engine failure, 539 Mike Alpha. As you look at this, there's a couple things that I think about. Basically, a pilot that took off, did a sightseeing tour of up and down a river, it looks like, then made a turn back to the runway. At some point, it easily appears they had an engine failure. And how do we know that? You can always look at the prop. The prop tells you so much. If you look at the accident scene, the prop clearly was not turning.
Right.
It appeared he clipped a tree and crashed the airplane.
Right.
And it was
And,
just
you
a
know,
mangled
Right,
mess.
and he was kind of in a tough spot where, it almost looked like he might be able to make it back to the airport, but there were no good landing spots available. So his best bet was trying to make it back to that runway, and he just came up short. Now, why that is, we don't know. Did he not have the altitude? Did it happen? May have just not had the altitude, even if he was right on best glide and the procedures right away. But regardless, he did not make it back to that runway.
Yeah, I will. And then there's another crash that occurred in January 2024. This one's interesting because this is November 6074 Alpha. I know this airplane so well. I bet I sold this airplane 3 times and trained 4 previous owners in this airplane. This was a gorgeous Mirage. I did not know the owner of this airplane or the pilot of this aircraft, but the pilot took off of South Texas and flew to Mexico. And we pretty much know he had a fuel exhaustion in the airplane. Now, I will tell you, I remember Barry Schiff, who I think is one of the best writers out there. He's been writing for decades and decades and decades for AOPA. And he wrote an article one time that basically said, if you have a fuel starvation in your event, it's your fault.
Oh, 100%,
Yep.
It's your fault.
Yeah.
And, not this aircraft, but we've seen Mirages before, and especially those that travel internationally. And the last one that immediately comes to mind was also a frequent traveler to Mexico. And the fuel stops just aren't easy to certain points. There's additional paperwork. You've got to file flight plans every time you take off from an airport in Mexico. VFRs, it's just more complicated. And so the tendency to try to stretch that fuel, and, we saw in one that needed a top overhaul at only 400 hours because they were regularly running it so lean of peak to make that Mexico run that it just toasted those cylinders.
Yep.
So, not to get into a lean of peak or rich of peak debate here. And of course,
But the idea behind it is that the pilot has a efficiency mentality where he's going to try to make it go as far as he can, have as little bit of fuel on board as he can, because you have it.
Absolutely, because a fuel stop is time and effort.
Yes, and I would agree with you 100%. And the key behind this is there's an old saying that's not true. It's not 100% true, but there's a lot of truth in it. Okay, which is, when's the only time you have too much fuel on board?
When you're on fire.
That's exactly right. The point is, a little extra fuel does you some good. In other words, if we have our airplanes that we have a Bonanza, and if I had a Mirage or a Malibu, I would not top my airplane every time, but I'd bring the level up higher. I'd rather have more fuel than less fuel. Here's the thing I'm going to say, and I see this over and over and over, is pilots miss the runway when on an engine failure by being short.
Right.
Okay, here's the training point behind this whole thing. If your engine fails, you can make a beeline directly over that runway, and you spiral down over that runway so that, you stay dang close to that runway.
But let's say there is no getting there with the altitude to spiral over. So on the North Carolina one, for example, he went almost straight out in a line and straight back in a straight line. Clearly, there was no excess altitude to reach that point. So what do you recommend in that situation? When you realize you are not going to make it back to a runway, and there's a number of ways we know that, especially in the more advanced avionics packages, because even if your engine fails, your avionics are still up and running, right?
Right.
So, a lot of times in the more advanced packages with the Garmin displays and GPS units, if you rolled that altitude selector down to, say, field elevation while you're going down, you've got that little blue bar.
Yeah, the blue banana.
The blue banana, the blue eyelash, the whatever you want to call it, that tells you where you're going to reach that altitude. So if you roll that down to field elevation, you can see you're going to come up short. So what do you do then?
Pick your best next best option.
Absolutely.
And see here, but here's this is a nuanced discussion, but I think it's worth having. If you look, to me, the greatest benefit of doing an engine failure maneuver is the flight path marker. Mm-hmm. Now, if you look at the flight path marker and you
now, just to clarify, for those who don't know what we're talking about, this is on Garmin equipped with synthetic vision. It's the green dot.
The green thing.
The green thing that moves around that we found most pilots completely ignore because they don't know what it's doing.
Well, it's telling you your flight path. And if you know your flight path, you know you have a plethora of information. Let me give you a good instance on this. If you take off in a piston airplane and you pitch up, you're going to climb. You're going to climb at 7.5 degrees to start with, and your flight path marker is going to be just below 7.5 at about 6 degrees. Mm-hmm. Now, what that means is you're climbing, the airplane's going up at a 6-degree angle. And if you're really smart and you know what your descent angle, what your glide angles are with an engine failure, you know that every PA-46 with either a feathered prop or a piston engine with the power, with the prop all the way back, it will glide at about 3.5 degrees in a no-wind scenario. Mm-hmm. Now, what this means, and we always take off into the wind, okay? You should. There's one of the many reasons, but here's the point behind the whole thing. Any PA-46 will climb greater than 3.5 degrees. So if you take off in a PA-46 and you climb at an angle greater than 3.5, theoretically, you should be able to turn back and make the runway. Now, we advise never turn back before 1,000 feet. Now, why? Because the answer is you have to turn all the way back around. You end up making a 360-degree turn to get back.
180.
No, it's
270. 270.
No, it's one. Because if you climb out, you got to make a 180-degree turn, and then another 90-degree turn to get back on the path, and then another 90-degree turn to get back to the runway.
Okay.
So, but the point that I'm making is you need 1,000 feet minimum to be able to make that 360-degree turn. If you climb out and you're like 539 Mike Alpha, where you went 10 miles away from the airport, you climb out at a greater than 3.5 degree angle, making that turns easy because you've got enough altitude, you're guaranteed to make it back to that runway if you're at best glide or better. Or you can go a little bit faster than best glide, but go to best glide. I'm totally fine with that. But if you look at that and your gear is up, your flaps are up, your prop is you pull your prop back, which most piston pilots don't even think about pulling that prop back. Pull it prop all the way to the stop to extend your glide. You're going to be at about a 3.5 degree descent angle. But they'll all climb above this. If you go to a Meridian or a JetPROP, those airplanes will climb out at a 7.5 degree pitch attitude, and you're actually at about a 7 degree angle of climb. So you're buying yourself a gob of altitude for the distance that you're covering because your angle is greater. Mm-hmm. So in any of these airplanes, in any turbine airplane, any turbine, your angle of climb is going to be greater, but they're all greater than 3.5. So if you climb out and you make 1,000 feet or greater, theoretically, you ought to be able to turn around and come back to that runway.
In theory.
In theory, but in practice as well, because you're almost always taking off into a wind. You're going to get better conditions if you fly it right. We just have so many pilots that end up short. Now, the question is, why do they end up short?
Well, and part of the reason is, let's go back to the scenario with Sully Sullenberger and putting that plane in the Hudson. And the reports afterwards where the simulator scenarios right after that, pilot after pilot after pilot, flight crews were making it to a runway, and they wanted to know why he didn't. And what was not taken into account was the delay and that startle factor. When that happens, if you're expecting it, sure, this is an easy maneuver that in theory the aircraft and the pilot should be able to do. When you're not expecting it, you really lose 15 to 30 seconds of valuable time there and altitude trying to figure out what just happened and what your response is supposed to be.
Correct. Wholeheartedly agree. I'm with you tracking. Here's my argument, though.
Okay.
Every pilot that has an engine failure, not every, it's too strong a word. Most that I see in training think an engine failure should look normal, look like a normal 3-degree approach angle. And they set the airplane up to be able to make that, to fly a 3-degree, everything's normal. If your engine has failed, it ought to look abnormal because you cannot descend at 3 degrees.
Right.
You're 3.5's the best you're going to get out of a PA-46. And I will tell you, if you dirty a PA-46 all the way up and you go to gear down, flaps down, and a full slip in the air.
12 degrees.
12 degrees.
Yeah.
That's right. You got to be between 3 and 12. Now, what's going to tell you 3 and 12 to make that runway? The answer is the flight path marker.
Absolutely.
And so if you look at both 6074 Alpha, which had an engine failure due to fuel starvation, and you look at 539 Mike Alpha, unless with 539, I don't know exactly with 539 Mike Alpha. I don't know if he had a Garmin flight path marker. I don't know if he had any of the, I don't know if he knew how to use any of these. But if you look at those two, and many others in the world that have engine failures, they always end up short. And the point is, they end up short because they make it look normal, and the airplanes won't make the runway.
Right.
You ought to be. This is one of the best reasons to get either over the airport or get high on the approach, and then now you're going to dirty the airplane up to have this steep approach angle down to the runway, and this is how you fly an engine out. It is not normal. If it looks normal, you will be short. And when you're short, one of the problems that occurs with both one guy clipped a tree, and then the airplane, broke apart and hit the ground, and everybody died. The other one, the one in Mexico, 6074 Alpha, it is clearly, there's no doubt about it, that this airplane stalled prior to hitting the runway. Because when they come down to the runway and you can't make the runway, what do you try to do? They try to stretch a glide.
Pull back.
They pull back on that stinking yoke. And when you do, you're going to get right next to that stall. When that wing stalls, that airplane's going to go over onto its nose. It'll impact the ground and there's unsurvivable.
Right. And, this is an interesting phenomenon. And it's one that I bet if you polled every pilot out there, they'll all tell you it happens. In their head, they know that the theory is when you get close to the ground, your instinct is to pull back, and that's where your highest risk of a stall is. And yet we see it happen time after time after time in these scenarios. And I know you and I catch a little flack sometimes for training these engine out scenarios all the way to the ground on a runway, but this right here is exactly why we do that. Because when you get to the bottom, and I brief all of these engine outs with anything doesn't look right at any point, add your power back in. It's there, it's available, and still they've got that mentality that they want to make it work so bad, they'll risk getting low and slow and all the things, and I have to add in power for them and tell them, let's go do it again. And the instinct to just pull back and try to make it because you're that close.
You cannot stretch a glide.
You cannot stretch a glide.
That's
Absolutely.
It. The only thing you can do is dirty the air, get very high, and get a 3.5 to 12 degree approach angle, which a 12 degree approach angle to a runway, it looks, if you're not used to it, if you haven't done it, it looks like you're falling out of the sky.
Oh yeah, it looks awful.
But it's the way to make that runway, because if you end up being short, what do? Now you can stretch a glide because you pull your gear up, pull your flaps up, come out of a slip, get rid of drag. Now you can make that runway.
Right. And for you turbine drivers out there, if you've never come down and tried to touch down on a runway with your prop in simulated feathered condition. Simulated. I don't want anyone out there actually feathering their props and touching down. But in a simulated feather condition, which is bringing it in with a small amount of torque, around 150, 170 pounds of torque or so for you M500 and 600 drivers, you eat up a lot of runway. It does not look normal. So even once you've made the runway, it's a whole new feel for how patient you've got to be sitting there in ground effect, watching that runway slide right by underneath you until this airplane's actually ready to settle down.
That's exactly right. I think one of the takeaways from these two piston engine, number one, be very, very good at an engine failure scenario, and practice this with your CFI. Go up there and get used to the idea of approaching a runway on a steep angle, and practice knowing what that looks like, because an engine failure can occur. Again, in North Carolina, there was one failure. In Mexico, there's 4 failures.
Fatalities.
Fatalities. Thank you very much. And so that's, I think that's the takeaway on this one.
And the other takeaway is, don't run out of fuel.
Don't run out of
I mean, if there is one thing that is within a pilot's control every single flight, it is where you choose to set down with enough fuel on board.
And I would say that's good anywhere in the world, especially in America. In America, you got 5,000 runways or whatever. Yeah, I mean, it is certainly easier. There's some places elsewhere in the world where you got to be more intentional. But in America, if you run out of gas, it's your fault.
It is.
It's your fault.
Absolutely.
All right, we've got 4 more. Oh my gosh, 4 more fatal accidents.
This has been a rough year for PA-46.
It's been a rough. If you look at October, this is, as we're recording this, is July of 2024. So you go back, we're going back to October, so 9 months. 9 months is where we're at. But there's 4 that are that we haven't even talked about yet. And let's glancingly go over these, and then talk about what we've got with all of them. The first is an airplane down in South America. Papa Sierra Mike Tango Golf. That's a lot of times in foreign registries you get names like, or nomenclature like that. This is January 2024 in South America. There are 7 people on board. Now, the first off,
yes, let's do the math. There are not 7 seatbelts on board.
No.
Which begs the question: is it legal to put more people than seats? And the answer is there's no regulation against it, other than for takeoff and landing, every passenger has to be in a seatbelt. So, if you've got 2 small kids, which we saw this in a Pilatus some years back, where there were 3 or 4 more people on board than there were seats on the aircraft. But so people will get in and strap 2 kids to a seat. Now, whether there were kids, I don't know.
I'm just here to say,
such a bad idea.
I don't know how to. I've had people ask me this question, and the answer is I don't really care what the legalities are. Are you really going to put your kids on board, strap 2 of them around one seatbelt, and simply pray that nothing happens? I mean, why don't you? I don't want you.
In an aircraft that's already easy to aft load as well.
I'm telling you.
Why would you contribute to that with extra people on board?
Agreed. Now, the other place that you can have, if you have a child less than 2 years old, then you can hold the baby in your lap and not have a seatbelt around them. But again, people, 1 seatbelt, 1 seat, 1 occupant, unless they're less than 2 years old, that's the answer. Just don't violate. I mean, anyway, there's 7 on board. The first thing out of my mind goes, what in the world are 7 people doing on a JetPROP?
Right.
Okay.
I mean, most of the time we're wondering what in the world 6 people are doing on a JetPROP.
right, exactly. Or yeah, now 4 on a JetPROP, I'm good.
Right,
but
absolutely.
6, I don't know. Anyway, or 7, no. Anyway, there's 7 people on board this airplane, and literally the airplane, it certainly appears the airplane flew into a thunderstorm, broke apart in flight, and literally was pieces all over the ground.
Right, and I'll tell you, this one came with a lot of video. There were cell phone cameras out there, and they caught, the videos of the wing tumbling down, clearly detached from the airframe. And, this one came with a lot of video. We know this broke apart in flight.
Yeah. So simply put, I think the story of this airplane is not 7 people, although it's a contributing factor to the horrificness of it.
I think it's a contributing factor to the decision making of this pilot from the very beginning, willing to put 7 people in and then fly through that level of convective activity. I think this goes, I think it is part of the story, but I think it goes to the pilot's overall decision-making skills regarding this flight.
His risk meter was broken.
Completely broken.
Risk meter's broken. Yeah. Okay. But flying into a thunderstorm is the real answer for this. There you go. Okay. Then we got 451 Mike Alpha in April. This is an airplane that flew over, basically flew from the north. I think it was Wisconsin, flew south. Area of convection. Clearly there's convection. It kind of looked like, sometimes you look at a radar picture, it's a one snapshot where the airplane's flying the whole way down. It's kind of like, where was the thunderstorm at the time? And people are smart enough, they can go figure all this out. And this one sure looks like a thunderstorm penetration as well.
Yeah. At the very least, and what I've found with some pilots newer to the airframe, and this was a Mirage, I believe, which means he's probably fairly new to the airframe, which means he was probably also new to flight in the flight levels, and the air and the turbulence and the convection is just different when you get up into the flight levels. It's just different, and you've got to treat it with much more respect than you would if you were going along at 8,000 feet.
Correct. Yeah. A cloud at 8,000 feet can be benign. A puffy cloud in the flight levels is not benign.
Never. It's never benign.
It's not benign.
Yeah, my rule of thumb, if it's over 15,000 feet, I'm going around it if I have any path around it.
That's it. Period. Case closed. But anyway, we've got an in-flight breakup, which appears to be a thunderstorm. And we got another one, 241 Papa Mike. This one's in May of 2024. 2 people on board. This one's a little bit more difficult for me to figure out. I'm not going to say this was a thunderstorm event. But now if you read the script on this one, on this accident, there clearly was moderate turbulence. Yes. This is where there's no doubt there's turbulence involved.
The pilot was reporting it himself to ATC through 24,000 feet all throughout his descent. Moderate turbulence, pretty much continuous. So we know that was there. Yeah,
we know that was there. And let's hold the discussion until we talk about the next one, because this airplane looks like it was taken off from Pensacola, Florida, flying north to Batesville, Arkansas, or somewhere up there, ends up crashing short of it, and it sure looks like the airplane had a turbulence event of some sort, or maybe a spatial disorientation event, something that didn't appear to be thunderstorm related.
There was also, and this one just happens to stick out because I was also flying that day. There was quite a bit of icing in that area, and it was not icing that was obvious by looking at your weather charts. But if you looked at the PIREPs, there was a lot of icing in the low 20s and high teens that day.
Yeah, it was May of 2024, and a lot of times, you're thinking, hey, it's summertime. Is there icing? And the answer is, yeah, there's icing all year long. The question in icing is, what altitude is it at? If you're in May or June, in the summer in the northern hemisphere, the icing is simply going to be there, but it's going to be up higher. And during the winter, it's going to be lower. So icing could play a part in this. But let's hold off on this because we've got one more. Really sad. We got 5 people on this airplane. 85 Papa Golf in June of 24, late June of 24. This is 2 weeks ago, or maybe even a week and a half ago, on the recording of this particular recording. Again, an in-flight breakup. So we're the 4th in-flight breakup in 5 months. And this one, the jury's not out on this one. This one, there was definitely convection in the area.
There was,
and
absolutely.
I think that the story of this flight is going to be convection. There is an argument to spatial disorientation, though.
I'm going to looking at the flight track. I think I'm going to fall into the spatial disorientation crowd, but potentially it's there because of the convection. Like, he could have been getting bounced around so much with a subpar autopilot on that old Continental Malibu. I don't know exactly what was installed, but we know what was installed the last time it was sold. And, it was a good old
KFC 150.
KFC 150.
Right.
Yeah. And so unless there was an upgrade, we know that autopilot doesn't perform great in turbulence. So if he's getting bounced around and the autopilot's not doing what he thinks it ought to be doing, he may have disconnected it, and then that contributed to the spatial disorientation.
He may have disconnected it. Also, that autopilot is one where if the trim servos sense too much movement, too much pressure,
disconnect itself.
It just turns it off and hands you the airplane. That the KFC 150 I find to be a really good autopilot with no safety features, and it doesn't speak to you well.
Right.
So if you're a newbie to this autopilot, if you're a guy that really, or a girl that really doesn't understand it, really doesn't have familiarization with it, and I would say that is in the 80% of the pilots that come to me with that autopilot installed, don't understand the full complexity of that autopilot. That's an autopilot that gets you in trouble real quick.
It will. It absolutely will. So yeah, the jury's out on this one because there were a number of things that could have contributed. We know there was weather. We can look at a flight track and tell it wasn't a straight line flown by an autopilot, or not an autopilot flying it well, which could contribute. So, a number of things happening here, and it'll be interesting to see how this one comes out.
But the overarching discussion of these 4 flights, okay, we don't know. We're not trying to pinpoint like it's this person's fault. That's not where we're going. What we're trying to say from people that are listening to this podcast, PA-46 pilots that are thinking, how can I not be an accident victim or an accident? How can I not show up in Dave McVinney's, or Manny Cassiano's presentation, or Dave McVinney's, I don't want to show up in his database.
Right.
How do I avoid this? And if you look at this, there's been, if I count the numbers right, 22 fatalities in 9 months through 8 accidents. And we haven't even talked about the non-fatals. There's been a bunch of those as well. How do you not show up there and you're in these last 4 within flight breakups?
Stay away from convection.
Okay.
I mean, at the end of the day, all 4 of those were simply flying too close to a convective activity. And that's not, we all end up in convective areas when we don't intend to, or we think it's past or whatever. We all get there at some point. And at the end of the day, if you find yourself there, then you slow down.
Here's
down.
Here's your thing. Hold on. Your thing, your point, and I get it, is stay away from thunderstorms. And the answer is, FAA tells you, 20 miles.
Gosh,
stay away from thunderstorms. That's it.
I don't go anywhere near them if I can avoid it. And I've got a lot of time trying to avoid thunderstorms. And I do. I avoid them. I do not pick my way through them with a good radar. I don't cut close to them. And I go all the way around them. And the couple times I haven't, boy, I've got stories to tell.
Let me tell you. Let me tell the story on this one. On this particular flight, on this particular day, literally when this was going down, because this was a weather event that was happening all the way from the south of the United States all the way to the north. The same weather event was happening, and I was down in JK.
Jack Edwards.
Jack Edwards. What JK? What? What's that?
JKA.
JKA. I was in Jack Edwards.
Gulf Shores.
Yeah, Gulf Shores. Lovely place. Lots of people. Very expensive. Good seafood. Anyway, so there you go. And I'm down there with a Mirage client. There's 2 of them. There's like 2 guys that fly the same airplane. Great guys. And we flew all over around that area, okay, in the same day. Went to probably 8 different airports and flew out to the north because there basically was a line of thunderstorms to our south. I flew to the north and then went up to a bunch of airports where there was no weather, and then had to get back into JKA. And when we come back in, there's just a gob of thunderstorms around there, and they're all moving away from it. The storms are moving south. We're up to the north. We're coming south. And the question is,
so they're moving away from you.
They're moving away from me, and they're coming over JKA and moving out. And the question is, how far? When do you go in?
Right. How far behind them can you really go in?
Yeah, and we didn't have just a boatload of fuel or an airplane load full of fuel. And I'll tell you, it was one of those days where I've scared myself a little bit with some storms in the past, and I distinctly with this storm looked at JKA and said, let's divert. We diverted to an airport probably 20 miles away to the north. landed there, got expensive fuel, and I remember getting on the ground and listening to the thunder rumble to the south and thinking, man, I'm glad I'm not on there. But on that same time, I probably got 5 texts from clients, people in our community that was like, have you heard of the latest accident?
Right.
And then I go look at this and go, gosh, but here I was mentally thinking, can I go in? Can I go follow this storm in, or am I too close? I made the call to stay away, but I could have easily been the guy that flew in behind the storm, got hit by lightning, and whatever the case. I made the right decision that day, but I'm not saying like, hey, look at me, do what I do. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I totally get it.
Right. It's a tough call. And, I love when we have training events and there's actually convection and thunderstorms in the area, not because I love convection and thunderstorms, but you get to go up, you get to point their radar at a cell and show them how the radar works and the different information it can give you and all of that. But at the end of the day, man, that's there to keep you out of it, not to get you as close as you can without getting into it, not to weave your way through them. It's to keep you out of it. And, if I see all that while I'm still on the ground, I'm probably staying on the ground a little bit longer.
Right.
It's an extra cup of coffee or 3.
Here's the point that we forget. And it shows the immensity of our earth, if you want to think of it this way. But there are 30,000 thunderstorms a day on the Earth's surface. And an average thunderstorm has the power in it of an atom bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki in World War II.
Yeah, it's absolutely
the energy expenditure is absolutely, but there's 30,000 of them. So for somebody just to naively say, well, I'll just never fly near a thunderstorm, or I'll never have to go around. You can't be a pilot and
avoid them forever.
That's right.
Right. And they pop up, especially when you're in aircraft like PA-46s, where you're traveling 800 miles. That's a lot of ground to cover. That's a lot of different climates to potentially go through, frontal passages, different pressure systems, different terrains. You can go from flatlands to mountains in that time. It's near impossible to know when you take off that you absolutely will not encounter something en route that you did not expect to be there.
That's right. But if you're listening to this podcast and you want to avoid Dave McVinney's spreadsheet or Manny Cosby, the point is
you don't want to be an object lesson at the next convention.
When you're at that place and you're flying that flight and you're given that option of landing short, diverting 25 degrees off your heading to, go completely around it or do that.
Absolutely.
The moral, the place we're trying to go to is say, you're going to lose every time. You fly into a thunderstorm, you're either going to, one of two things going to happen. You're going to end up with an in-flight breakup, and you're everybody in your airplane's going to die, including you.
Or you're going to have so much hail damage.
You're going to have hail damage.
Your plane's going to be scrap anyway.
You're going to get hit by lightning, or whoever's on that airplane will never fly with you again. Never again will they ever fly with you again.
Yeah. So let's talk about the scenario. And again, the climate is just different in the flight levels. So if you're new to the flight levels, if you've just come out of your turbocharged Bonanza or your Cirrus, where you never really got above 17,000 feet, and you're up in the flight levels, with some of these storms, you get some upper level winds that'll blow the tops out. It'll kind of obscure your view. Now, I always say a view out my window is worth 1,000 radar returns. I'd rather be able to see what's out there than I would to paint it on a screen. But let's say your view is obscured and you bumble into the top of something.
Yeah.
What do?
You got to slow down.
You got to slow down. How far do you have to slow down?
Well, VA in these airplanes, everybody talks about VA, but VA is not enough. And there's the sad part about it is, usually VA in most of these PA-46s is about 130 to 135 knots. But the problem is that is 130 to 135 knots.
At max gross.
At max gross. and you're almost never at max gross, which means that when you're at a lesser gross weight, which means that VA actually is lower.
So let's talk about the logistics of this a little bit, because I've noticed when I tell someone, let's say we're just going out and just going to do steep turns. I'm like, all right, slow below VA. It is tough to get these things below 130 knots. Like,
it's a slick airplane.
it is a slick airplane. You are very near flight idle in both the pistons and the turbines. So when you think you've got to get to that airspeed that slow from a normal cruise, if you're thinking you're just pulling back a couple 100 pounds of torque or a couple inches of manifold, that is not the answer. You are pulling way back or deploying some drag devices to get it there. Do not lower your flaps. Do not
touch your flaps. Don't.
That's not the drag devices I'm talking about.
But the drag device you're talking about is the landing gear.
Or speed brakes if you're
if you got them. But I'll even say, just go landing gear. Landing gear is better. It's more drag. And here's the deal: you could be at way over VNE on a PA-46, any one of them, way over it. Throw the gear out, and you will not hurt the gear. You'll hurt the little fairings on the gear.
Right.
Okay. But you will save the day. You got to slow down. You bumble into severe turbulence of any sort.
You got to slow down.
And you look out on the wing and it's still there. Okay, drop the gear. You've got to drop the secret in a PA-40. Do not touch the flaps, because here's the deal. If you look at VA, there's a formula, and in the formula for VA, it's like 3.8 times the square root of the load factor, blah, blah, blah. And then
this is where you lose me.
Yeah. Well, here's the point. Here's the point. The stall speed is in the formula. So the stall speed, when the stall speed goes down, so does VA. So here's the point. And the other factor that no one ever thinks about is a gust. It's a 4-letter word. A gust is a 4-letter word, just like some other 4-letter words. It's a cuss word.
No need to elaborate.
No, there you go. It's a 4-letter word. Gust is a 4-letter word. And here's the point behind it: is a gust is an upwards moving air. And when you have an upwards moving air, your angle of attack increases while your speed is still up there. So in other words, you're flying through the air at, let's just say, 150 knots. And you're at a load factor of 1. And everything's fine. Well, you hit a gust that's going up, and let's just say it's a 30-mile-an-hour gust, which is nothing in a thunderstorm. Nothing. A thunderstorm can have 100+ straight up in the air gust. What that means is, as this gust hits the airplane, the angle of attack increases instantly, and lift, which is another 4-letter word that's not as bad, but lift is your enemy when you hit into turbulence. Lift is the bad guy. Lift is what's going to rip your wing off.
Absolutely.
And so anything that adds lift, i.e. flaps, anything that adds lift, i.e. a gust, is going to be the thing that's going to rip your wing off. You're trying to stay. So what do you want to do? And the answer is slow yourself down. I will tell you, in any PA-46, any TBM, any King Air, go to 100 knots. And I'm way below VA. But the answer is 100 knots. You're just trying to survive this event. You're not trying to get to your destination. You're trying to make sure your wings don't fall off. And let me promise you, when you fly into a thunderstorm or fly into any kind of really hard convection, you're going to feel the wings stalling. You're going to feel shuddering. And that's going to be your wings stalling. And thank the Lord it's stalling, because if it didn't stall,
it'd fall off.
The lift that's on that wing would rip the wing off. So the answer is, you got to slow that airplane down. If you hit anywhere into an area of convection, throw the gear instantly. Throw the gear and slow your little tail down to 100 knots. Now, when you're at 100 knots, you're going to be safe. No one will ever fly with you again. It's your last time to have passengers on board there. You'll probably never fly again, but you'll survive the event, because if you look at a convection activity, it's literally a column of air that's shooting up into the sky at such a velocity. Again, it can be 100+ miles an hour, but they're real short-lived.
Yeah, and I would say, in addition to throwing the drag out and slowing yourself down, if you preferably disconnect your autopilot. If you don't, at least take it off altitude hold. What you don't want is that autopilot trying to fight against those gusts and that lift and those downdrafts and putting additional forces on those wings that don't need to be there. Just accept the up and down and that you're going to come out the other side a little bit worse for the wear, but intact. And
not a little bit worse. You're going to come out. You're going to come out
Right.
looking like a rag doll.
But let ATC know that you're unable to maintain altitude. They'll give you a block. They'll work with you, and when you get to clear air again, you can.
You can
resume
regroup
ops as
yourself, and
normal.
you can go clean your underwear out, and
Absolutely.
and then you can go, everything will be fine. But the point behind the whole thing is you have to slow down, and it won't be long. It will not. I mean, you less than a minute, you'll be out.
Yeah.
It'll all be good after that, if you're there. Otherwise, what happens to these people happens to you. And the point is, you're not going to win against a thunderstorm. You have to slow down. You have to avoid it. You cannot go there. You will lose every time. Let me ask you this. Do we have a bad airplane?
Oh, absolutely not. We have a great airplane.
Right. I mean the PA-46.
Yeah.
We don't have a strength of wing problem. We don't have a spar problem. We don't have a structural problem.
No.
We got a problem with people flying into severe turbulence, i.e. a thunderstorm. And I think at the end of the day, you're going to end up with, on all four of these accidents, I think you're going to end up with weather-related, people flying too fast in an area where there was just too bumpy, and this is what happens.
Right. We have a knowledge and aeronautical decision-making problem here. And, people just not having the knowledge or the training to know how to deal with these types of scenarios when they really get in them. Because, again, they've probably never been there in the flight levels in their other planes.
All right, so let's recap. If you're going to know your power rollback and engine failure, know how to fly that. Mm-hmm. Know what your more levers for. If you have an engine failure, know how to fly it and stay high. We want to be high. Don't want to be short. Everybody's short and lands short of the runway. And then your question is, are you in the trees or in the grass? Hopefully grass, but hopefully you land on the pavement. And then in-flight breakups. Yeah. In-flight breakups are slow down. Slow the airplane down in turbulence. And then the last one is just don't fly near thunderstorms. Just stay away from those things.
Yeah. 20 miles is what the FAA recommends, and that is a very good number. Yeah. That is a very good number for the hazards associated with thunderstorms up in the flight levels.
Yeah. Deanna, thanks for joining Malibu Guru Podcast. Always good to have you here.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, it's good advice. So we've had one of the worst 9 months that I can remember. I can't think of a time in the PA-46 community where we've had so many fatals, so many just bad statistics that are out there. And I think if you consider this and think about how maybe think in the back of your mind that I'm going to avoid thunderstorms, I'm really going to learn about the Moore lever or how to fly an engine out. Hopefully these things resonate with you, and just a place where you can commit yourself to increasing your margin, increasing your level of safety, and hopefully we can stop this trend that we've got of fatal accidents happening in the PA-46 world. We've got a great airplane, a strong airplane. What we need is people that are going to fly them with responsibility and making good decisions, good aeronautical decision making. Joe Casey with Casey Aviation, Deanna Casey, signing off.